It's really a pleasure to welcome Arne Maynard here this morning. Arne Maynard is a famous name now in contemporary horticulture, as you all know. He's celebrated for his incredibly beautiful gardens, really now all over the world, not just in the UK, but here in the States as well. He's an RHS Gold Medal and Best in Show winning designer, and he's very knowledgeable in a general and broad sense about architecture and garden history and craftsmanship and interior design, and I'm sure you're going to learn about all that. I think he's famous, and I think you can tell in his books, which are all for sale outside. This is his most recent book, The Gardens of Arne Maynard. It's a very beautiful book, very inspiring. He's very well known for his ability to draw out the sort of essential sense of place in the gardens where he works. And he doesn't consequently alter the landscapes too drastically, I think, so I'm sure he'll tell you about that. This is a lecture series, of course, the second in the series, which is about gardeners' own gardens. And Arne's going to focus on Allt-y-bela, his garden in Wales, in the countryside there. So please join me in welcoming Arne Maynard.
Thank you very much for that lovely welcome. Just make sure I get this right. I'm going to talk to you today about two of my own gardens. One that I created and started working on when I was 29 years old. And we lived there for 15 years, and it was a house called Ganic House. And the other garden is where we are at the moment. We moved from there and we bought a house in Wales, which is called Allt-y-bela. And of course, that garden, as any garden, is never finished. It's always carrying on, evolving and being designed. I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I started. I've always gardened. My earliest memories have been of gardening. So before I walked, I think I was in the garden digging around in the soil. And I was talking to my mother the other day, and she reminded me that there came a point where she actually didn't have very much lawn left. And this was when I was at about the age of 8 or 9. And I started digging up the grass everywhere, and I planted more and more flowers. I was given a greenhouse for my Christmas present when I was about 9 years old. And of course, I didn't have very much taste at that age, so I grew annuals and every single variety of annual that you could imagine. And so my mother's garden was this riotous, clashing color, everything that high. No variation in heights, but it was an amazing experience to garden at that age and learn to grow plants from seed and seeing things coming up and pricking them out. And of course, I'd have far too many trays of petunias and marigolds and fibrous-rooted begonias. So, of course, the lawn had to go. So, slowly. But my godmother, who also was a very keen gardener, who was great friends with my mother, I think they had a secret pact. And my godmother thought, right, enough is enough. My friend doesn't have any lawn left, and I've got to help her. So she took me on, and it wasn't until a couple of weeks ago I realized what she was doing. But she took me for a whole summer. Every week, 2 or 3 days a week, we'd go and visit gardens. And she called it the education of a gardener. I know I was 13 years old because she said, for your 13th birthday present, we're going to visit gardens. And she called our garden tour an education of a gardener. Now, of course, I realize that she was obviously referring to Russell Page's book, The Education of a Gardener. So this was one of the first properties she took me to. This is Cranbourne Manor in Dorset, a wonderful Jacobean house, gardened by Lady Salisbury, who became my gardening guru. I thought everything she did was marvelous. And this was such a turning point from having grown annuals and all these plants that I loved at that time. To go and see a garden like this, it's like, my goodness, there's something completely different that I just love. And I became so hungry to see these sorts of gardens. So I had this amazing time with my godmother, just touring England, visiting amazing houses. And this imagery, this vocabulary has stayed with me forever. So I'm incredibly grateful that I had the support from my family to allow me to be able to indulge in my passion and to actually use my passion as my career. What I particularly loved about Cranbourne Manor was the fact that Lady Salisbury gardened in such a way that there was formality and it was all mixed with the wild. there was a balance between nature and with cultivation. As you can see here with the cow parsley, it's just allowed to grow against this beautiful facade of an important house. But then, we went to Kirby Hall in Northamptonshire, and I can remember my godmother standing here saying, "Isn't it amazing that it doesn't have colour? Look at all that lovely grass." So, it was the education of my gardening that was through her, with her taste, helping my mother preserve some normality at home, that educated me in a style of gardening that I absolutely love. So I love English garden design of this period because there's a plainness, a simplicity to it. It's complicated, but there's a simplicity. If you look at French gardens of this period, they're all over-swirled and fleur-de-lis everywhere in box, and it becomes very complicated. But I just love the plainness that you get here with just the grass and the gravels and the white painted pots. Probably traditionally this would have had orange trees set out in the lawn parterre. And the other thing that I was given when I was about 14 were some lovely early Kipps engravings. And I used to pore over the Kipps engravings and look at the pattern making. And I think more than anything, this taught me about design. And I would just look and look and look, and I would start to identify things like little pavilions. Now you'll see my garden in Ganic is, a representation of these little pavilions. The things I absorbed when I was looking at all of these images. And I wish I had a screen this big when I was small, because all of a sudden I've started noticing things that I didn't even notice when I was poring over them. But it's all full of wonderful pattern making and rows of pots and these orangeries here with the leaded lights and this lovely lean-to roof. You could just go on picking out details, which become very much the foundation block of how I like to design. So this leads me on to my first garden. Now, this house was called Ganic House. It was in the Fens, and the Fens are in East Anglia. It's reclaimed land. The earliest reclamation was carried out by the Romans. So this would have all been sea marshes and below sea level. Our house was the only contour line in the area. We were 9 foot above sea level. And there were dikes that threaded right through the landscape, which every time they reclaimed a little bit more land, then they built another dike, shut out the sea, and it's very, very fertile ground. So we gardened in a very flat environment with incredible soil, and it was like being in a prairie. And so immediately for me, it felt right that in this flat landscape, my sort of passion for those Kipps engravings could be realized. And so I felt it, and the house was Dutch. The Fens were drained a lot by the Dutch, so the house had a very Dutch feel. So I felt justified that my garden could have this sort of William and Mary feeling about it, style-wise. And it was really important here to enclose the garden. Where we are now in Wales, you'll see it's all about connecting to the landscape and not enclosing, but with the garden in the Fens, the wind came from Siberia. It was freezing. It's what we called a lazy wind. It didn't go round you, it just went straight through you. And at the beginning, before we planted lots of hedges in the garden and peach trees, we couldn't eat outside. The salad would literally blow off your plate in the summer. So it was really important to create a garden that was nestled and you went into, and it was an oasis within this very vast agricultural landscape. And it was a beautiful landscape. Wonderful and very, I absolutely loved the way, every spring and winter it would be sown with wheat. And you'd have the seasonality was very much stronger there, because by September, there was nothing there. It was just ploughed fields again. So here the summer ended really early, because by August they'd harvested, and then it was bare soil until March. But within this flat landscape, the house, it was sort of like a ship at sea. And the corn was like the waves of the sea, and the house was the ship. And it was also for me, it was very important that when we bought the house, there was absolutely no garden. We sat in the middle of fields like this. So we had to carve out a garden space out of agricultural space. The plough line came right up to the door of the house, right up to here. And it skirted round, there was a little bit of wall left here, and it skirted around. That tree was original to the house, which was planted in 1500, and it skirted round the back. And so there was no garden. So when we started, also I couldn't really afford to put a garden in. It took all of our effort to buy the house. We were only 29, we were mad. I don't know if I'd ever do it again, but yes, I would do it again. But it was really exciting. But this garden and my garden where I am now, I never once put pen to paper. I gardened this garden. And the garden developed through gardening. And I think that's the thing I really want to bring across in the talk about my gardens, is that my passion is gardening, and I would say almost my career is gardening, and my hobby is garden design. But what's interesting is that because I didn't actually design the garden, it evolved through the planting of plants. And through my areas in the garden were created by what I wanted to grow in them. So I started collecting my plants first, and then I formed the landscape, which isn't how it happens with clients. And this took 15 years, and I built the garden slowly over 15 years. And the house was very beautiful on the outside. It had been done up by an architect who then decided to buy a farm. But the interior hadn't touched, and that's what I really loved. I loved the fact that the inside was this sort of study in decay, wonderful peely plaster. We had one bedroom in the house we called the safe room, because it was the only room plaster in the night didn't fall on you from above. But I loved the fact that it was really soft, and I felt also then that my garden could be a tighter, more organized design garden, because the interior is very soft. And I just love this sort of, personally, this is what I love. I love flowers when they are overblown and the petals are all on the table. So, my gardens, in a way, my own personal gardens reflect this looseness as well, this romance. But equally, the important thing is the views from inside out. And I always try and design gardens, and more so my own garden, really, because I'm always in the house looking out. It's about the connection between the inside and the outside, and the views that you get from inside the house out into the landscape. So this is a photograph that we were terribly brave. We went up in a microlight to take this. It was like sitting in a go-kart with wings. Absolutely terrifying. Anyway, it managed to get us a couple of good shots. But this garden, the garden at Ganic, because it was an early Dutch-style house, a brick house, and because the yew tree in the middle here, this tree was planted in around 1600, and it was planted exactly on the center of the house. So it immediately said to me, I can do formality here, because that far back they already planted this one tree right at the center. And I created a garden very much like those Kipps engravings, where it was all about axes. And I have one long axis that runs through here along the terrace, through the hornbeam walk, and right in the field here there was an obelisk. I have another axis that runs through the herbaceous garden into the lime walk and runs out, everything enclosed by hedging. And then I have another axis that comes through the winter garden, rose garden, and into the physic garden. And then finally, the last axis runs through the physic garden, across the lime walk, and then into the vegetable garden. So you can see it's a garden that's really based, the design work has been based on a formal backbone, and then it has created spaces that I can garden within. So going into the first part of the garden, so coming out from the house, from the front door, originally there was a wonderful old river that crossed the property, and you entered by barge. They would have come by barge, and it was on the pilgrim route to a place called Walsingham, and it's apparently where King John lost his jewels as well, here in the Fens. So I was always very hopeful of finding them. Never did. And there used to be a double avenue of walnut trees that led to a beautiful bridge over the river. And then in 1860, they drained another part of the Fens, and the water level dropped by 16 feet, and they filled the river in. So this landscape is very much a man-made landscape. But in this upper garden, the yew tree becomes the focal point, and it leads you from the upper garden, which is the herbaceous garden, down to the lime walk where I have bleach trees that ran around a formal lawn in the middle, and then a simple gap in the hawthorn hedge that leads you back into the fields of barley or wheat or fodder beans, whatever was being grown. One of the things that was really lovely about this part of the garden was that these walls were still here, and it stopped about here, but all of the foundations for the walls were still there. And so when it was hot in the summer, I saw exactly where the old wall used to be. So I didn't reinvent anything, I just put back the wall where it needed to go, where it was before, which gave me this wonderful, more formal space, which was our herbaceous garden right next to the house. One thing that, as I started planting in this garden, and I started planting my lime trees, which were here, I realized that every time I put the spade in the ground, I hit brick. And I only went down that far, and it was brick. And I'd dig up the bricks, and they'd go down that far. And I just thought, this is impossible. So I spoke to our neighbor, who said, oh, yes, there used to be a barn here, and they knocked it down, and the bricks are all the same bricks as the house. So then we spent 3 years digging up the bricks by hand, cleaning the bricks, and we cleaned 35,000 bricks by hand and stacked them. We didn't have very many friends left after this period, because every weekend we'd invite them for brick cleaning. But it was really lovely that we built all of these walls and put the walls back with the bricks that we dug out of the garden. And so they were made at the same time that the house was made. And it's this passion that I love. I love this sort of interconnecting with the history and what's there and reusing and putting back the walls. And it gave us this wonderful space into which I had on, it was very symmetrical. And you'll see my house where I am now is not about symmetry at all. But we had a central path that led up, oops, that was the wrong, central path that led up from the lime walk, which was on axis to the front door, and either side we had parallel herbaceous borders. These borders I wanted to create a little bit more interest in the winter. I don't particularly like seeing herbaceous borders with bare soil from the house all winter. So I planted buttresses which punctuated the border. So when you looked from the windows from the house, you looked onto a series of buttresses, and when you were in the garden, you looked between the buttresses onto the flowers. So in the spring, it started off, so here you can see the buttresses nestled in with the bench. I very much liked a garden called Garsington. This was another one my godmother took me to where they used to have opera. And they had a garden with lots of Irish yews in it. So I sort of, my memory bank of things that I loved played its place, and I put Irish yews in behind the bench. And in one of the Kipps engravings, I saw a bench which I loved, and I got my magnifying glass out and I started drawing it. And this is a result of the bench out of one of the Kipps engravings. And in the spring, we would start off with our bulbs in this particular border. Of course, I was there for 15 years, and the wonderful thing about having your own garden is nothing stays the same. We're always eager to change things and try new colors. This was where I was just as we left, when we sold the house. And the tulips in here, I wanted it to look like a really rich ruby ring, full of, there was Van Roos in here, Queen of the Night, Recreado, and various other tulips, but I wanted it to be really rich, the palette of color. Unfortunately, which you don't see in the shot because I pulled all their heads up, but I did mistakenly, I was sent bright yellow tulips. And normally tulips don't come back, but these ones were determined to get stronger every year. So every year I would cut armfuls of yellow tulips, which even in the house I didn't like. And apparently they're still doing really well, and all these ones have died out. But I enjoyed the succession of this garden and the flowering in this garden. So after the tulips were just finishing, then the alliums, this is Allium afflatuense, Purple Sensation. They started coming out, some tree peonies, some geums and potentillas. And it was this very rich coloured border. I had gone through lots of other colour phases. I had blue borders, I had white borders, but this is where I ended up at the end of living there. And interestingly, then this is in the summer, I had 15 years of gardening this particular border, and it went through lots and lots of interpretations. This is, again, and I wanted to put this slide in, this is when we sold the house and we left. And it's very interesting that actually my gardening style at Ganic House changed over the 15 years. Here, it's already much looser. The earlier borders were very traditional. Tall plants at the back, coming down, very English, not so flowy, not so meadowy. And I think just naturally I evolved into wanting things to be a little bit looser. And you'll see the transition now to Allt-y-bela, where it's very much looser. And I really like the onopodum just where it's seeded at the front. I like the fact it's not at the back. I think it provides more interest in the garden. And you can see it's much more meadow-like rather than a more traditional herbaceous border. And my palette of colour started to change as well. And I think for me, one of the most exciting things about creating gardens, whether it's for clients or creating my own garden, it is about the plants. And I design gardens as spaces to garden within. I don't design gardens that are just seen. I design gardens for clients and for myself to be gardened. Here's a few of the plants that we had in. One of my favorites was this, I love the combination of this one rosa geranium, which had hips in the autumn, and epilobium, which was called Stahlrose, this lovely color. This was still in the herbaceous borders, and on the other side, we'll come back to that later, the pavilions were in the rose garden. And these were the views out of the house from the upper floors. So you can see very much the referencing here with the pavilions to those sort of Kipps engravings. They had started life off as fruit cages, and they were supposed to be oak fruit cages with netting on, and I was going to keep quails in them. It became really apparent that because the East Anglia, the Fens, it's not very warm in the summer. I mean, it was really difficult to sit outside beyond 8:30, 9 o'clock in the evening, because it just gets really cold and you get the sea mist coming in. And so I was desperate to be out in the garden, to be somewhere in the garden environment without being in the house, but leaving the house to go and dine somewhere and eat somewhere and maybe to work in. So that's really why then we built these pavilions. And they form a very nice division between what is the physic garden and the rose garden. And we'll come back to that later. But also in this very big flat landscape, it needed some more architecture in it because it was such a vast, you could see, as far as the eye could see, you could see. So there are not even trees growing, a few over there, but you can see it's a very open landscape. So in the main herbaceous garden, we had, the main axes became the terrace. It wasn't about big terraces, it was about small intimate spaces. I loved the fact that all of my violas and things seeded into the paving. So this is something that's always been with me, this sort of looseness of things growing out of paving and giving it a softness and a romance. And this terrace led you through, again, one of the other axes to this column that I put in, and I just spotted a little lamb there. But I really loved the fact that this garden, feeling very Dutch, had these long axes that drew the eye out. So as you went from the terrace to down towards that column, you went into, you stepped down a few steps, and you went into another area which was called, this was the winter knot garden on this side here, and then the other way it went into the rose garden. So it really was a garden of compartmentalization, a series of garden rooms, and those garden rooms had different functions. Now, where I am at Wales, it's completely the opposite. I don't enclose gardens or garden areas to garden a particular type of plant. But here in this landscape, it was about this enclosure, and I would have somewhere that would just be for winter plants, just for summer herbaceous, just for spring bulbs. And you came into this square, and this was the the knot garden, the winter knot garden. Now, this was an impossibly difficult part of the garden to photograph, but the pattern making are squares and lozenges, and these would be cut really sharp. And in the winter, the copper beech just had its copper leaves, and it was just a really lovely, calm place to go and sit, have a cup of tea in January on the bench, and it was a study in just a green brocade, really. But that led you through, and it was an important junction. There were these spaces in the garden. Some of the garden areas were really full of flower, but then I always went back into an area of garden that was calm and green. And then you go into another flower area, and then you come back into the green. Because I felt that just going from flower to flower, it was just too much. You needed to have, I always describe it's like having a rich meal, and it's an absolute delight to have sorbet between the courses. And this is sort of similar. It's a palate cleanser. And that led you through into what I called the wilderness garden at the back of the house. This was when we started, this was actually my first attempt at growing topiary myself. Now, of course, I can't stop growing it, but at this stage, I just had 6 topiary that lined a diagonal path in the courtyard and wilderness garden. And what was so magical here, I didn't really want to do very much here because it was already very beautiful. It was full of ancient apple trees and lots of snowdrops, which I added to. And there was a tranquility about it. It didn't actually need a lot of garden. So you can see in the spring the aconites and snowdrops. And one thing that I really learned from this garden and from all these things that existed was that when we're creating new gardens for clients, it's one of the first things I did at Allt-y-bela was plant thousands and thousands of snowdrops. So at Allt-y-bela so far, I've planted about 65,000 snowdrops. Every year we plant another 5,000 or 10,000, and we just expand it out into the woodlands. And what's really lovely by doing that, you plant 5,000 a year. It doesn't actually take that long to plant 5,000 snowdrops. But what happens then over a period of 5-6 years, you start getting this feeling that the garden has been there forever, because you're giving it this amazing expanse in the spring. And it provides antiquity really quickly to a garden. So one of the first things that I did, and really it's because we had all of these here, they'd always been there, and it's something that I learned from this garden that I now do in most of my gardens, is this flooding of bulbs to give it that sense that it's always been a garden. And here with the crocus thomasinianus, there's straight thomasinianus and Whitwell purple, and then the winter aconites. And of course, I can't have a garden of my own without having hellebores. For me, they're one of the most amazing plants. I love collecting my own seed and trying and seeing if I can get some particular new varieties from my own seed. And actually, interestingly, a very dear friend, who I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of, Rosie Atkins, who was a curator at the Chelsea Physic Garden. She was a really good friend, and when we moved, I said, Rosie, I don't know what to do, which plants I should take with me when I move. And she said, don't take any plants. She said, it's such a liberation. Start fresh, start new, don't take any. Of course, I didn't quite do what she said, but I only took 2 plants, so I'm quite pleased with myself. One was a particularly beautiful dark hellebore, and the other was my treasured rhubarb plant that I was given by my godmother. So I left Ganic House Garden complete. I walked out, the day we walked out, it was pristine. I left everything, all the garden tools, all the antique terracotta pots. I had about 3,000 antique terracotta pots in my potting shed. Everything was left as though I was going to come back the next day, because I didn't want to start taking something that I'd created and put so much passion, I didn't want to start taking it apart. And actually, it was really enjoyable starting again and finding the new things. And of course, when the hellebores finished, a little bit about my childhood, again, coming back in, where I have to pack plants in and I have to make them work. So I used to grow hundreds of foxgloves, Sutton's apricot, and also Purpurea alba, and just in the area where the hellebores were, we would just bed them out, and we would just have huge drifts of these going right back into the woodland. And interestingly, is when I was putting this lecture together, it became quite clear how I've changed with my own garden, my own gardening styles. Now, when we first moved to Ganic House, not in a million years would I have let the grass grow long in this courtyard. It would always been kept cut. And this was a photo that was taken just before we left, and I really loved the fact that it was looser here. So I think I was already changing as a designer, changing as what I needed and wanted from my garden, and everything was becoming more relaxed. The lovely Paul's Himalayan musk growing out of the tree. So it's interesting to look back at these photos. I actually haven't looked at the photos of Ganic House for a long time, and this is about the first time that I've put a lecture together on it, because I'm still quite emotional about having left a garden I created. So I sort of, for quite a long time, I blanked it out. And when I wrote the last book, we put it in there. But it's really nice looking back and seeing my evolution of how I garden my own gardens, and how there's a lot of similarity, but there's also changes. So on the outer side of the garden, we have the big hornbeam hedges that holds it in and sort of separates it from that vast flat landscape. And then as you get closer to the more cultivated garden, and the hedges changed and they became taxus, or we had walls. And you can see here the pavilions that divide the rose garden from the physic garden. But this side of the garden that was more casual then is where we had our orchards, and we'd have, again, big planting of bulbs. You can see this sort of influence of the Kipps Mount playing back in. And what was so magical about the Mount here, because the landscape was very flat and we had tall hedges to keep the wind out, it was actually a chance to actually elevate yourself and to see the views from there. And there was nothing more magical than at 6 o'clock in the evening taking a glass of wine, sitting on the Mount. And we used to have a barn owl, and you used to go up and down the dikes, and you just sit there watching this white barn owl slowly flying up and down looking for mice. And of course, they were created to watch hunts from as well, and to be able to see gardens and pattern making in gardens, especially in the Dutch gardens where it was very flat. So I had it at the end of my orchard, and in the orchard I had, all these wonderful bulbs that came up every year and multiplied, all my fritillarias, the narcissi. I only tend to use one until recently, I only tended to use one narcissi, which is Narcissi lobularis, which is our English native narcissi. I love the fact it seeds everywhere, and it's a very beautiful pale yellow, and it's not a big trumpet, it's a small trumpet, it's very delicate. Now I'm starting to collect, and I'll come back to that later, collect more interesting narcissi, but not the great big blousy flowers. I like the more species varieties. But here in this orchard, it was about the fruit and the cowslips on the mound and the fritillarias and the Herbaceous that flowered then after the narcissi. What particularly worked well, which was totally accidental, but I do it a lot now, is that at home, at least, the Herbaceous flower at exactly the same time, the blue ones, as the apple blossom. So you get this beautiful combination of the blue flower with the pink apple blossom. And then after these flowered, totally by accident, I used to grow salsify in my vegetable garden. And the birds took the seed, and then they ate the seed here, and their droppings went into the orchard. And then in June, I would have salsify flowers that came up in lilac under the apple trees as well. And of course, for me, a garden is about producing fruit and vegetables as well. I love the fact that the garden has a reality. I love the fact that, it's sustainable. We don't buy vegetables very much. We eat all our own vegetables. And we have all our own fruit, apples and pears. We bottle fruit. We freeze vegetables. So it's really nice to be self-sufficient, and that's as an important part as anything else for me personally with my gardens. So then coming back from the orchard, you then come into the rose garden. So you can see here how Ganic House, it was a very structured garden. It was that very William and Mary style, these Baroque hedges, leading you through the pavilions. This pavilion was, this was the winter pavilion here, that was a chimney, the smoke came out of the finial, and this was the summer one where I kept citrus. So in the winter, we'd light the fire in here, and we'd have lunch in there and dinner in there. On the coldest days, it meant I could be in the garden without actually freezing. But the nice thing about the rose garden, this pattern making, especially in this flat landscape, was that it added another dimension that we weren't getting from the flat landscape. Where we are in Wales, with all the hills and all the trees, we have a different interest, we have different focal points. So here in the landscape, and by being enclosed, by having this sort of more pattern-made garden, worked very well. And it would start in the spring, white triumphant tulips and spring green. And this was the route through then, through the buildings to the physic garden, which had a fountain at the center, which again was a very pivotal axle point within the garden. And I particularly love rose gardens where it's not just roses. I like mixing things in to soften the rose, rather than just having roses on their own. And in the spring, it had the tulips. The roses were all grown. They're all historic roses. They're all grown on hazel domes and trained. And by training them and wrapping the branches horizontally, we get a lot more flower. And a lot of old-fashioned roses, when they're heavy and when it rains, they all face downwards. By tying them onto these domes, we're able to create roses that flower. You know, the dome has now disappeared, and they send up all these shoots, and you end up with a lot more flower. So one of my favorite roses is Isfahan, and again, Königin von Dänemark. So roses have stayed with me all the way through from Ganic to Allt-y-bela. But you can see with the mix of the foxgloves. So I guess this is, this is my style of the way I like to plant up. But equally in the winter, I love to be able to bring plants into the house. One of my favorite hyacinths is this one called Hyacinthus orientalis, which is a true Roman hyacinth, which is really hard to find now. I've just again refound it. And it actually smells more like lily of the valley than hyacinths. It's really beautiful. And this was the summer pavilion with the citrus in it. But again, the importance of having these views out into the garden. The physic garden, again, was one of these cool breathing spaces. So you went from all the color of the rose, and then so you start with the knot garden, which is this cool space. Then you go into the rose garden, which is very colorful. Then you come back into the physic garden, which is an architectural green space. And the planting is very simple. It's iris florentinas in the summer and tulips in the spring. So now we're in the physic garden, a very simple series of square beds with topiary quercus ilex in it, and then an old marble fountain in the center. And in the summer, later on in the summer, around the fountain, I had a wet area of planting. The irises in the center part were Iris pallida, and we had Primula vialii, which I love the sort of slight contemporary feel that this gave with the color. And before they were in flower, we had the Iris florentina. Now, Iris florentina is a very historic iris. It's the iris that produces orris, which is a perfume that the Romans used. You dry the root, and then you grate the root, and it smells of violets. So we used to make our own violet potpourri from the roots of this iris. But it has this lovely smoky gray color. And then from that, this was then the axes that you saw from the kitchen garden across the lime walk. So that's the kitchen garden, and then you had the lawn. It wasn't a huge garden. We had 5 acres of garden in all, which most of it was orchards and some woodland planting and sheep paddocks. So of intensive garden, we probably had 2 acres. And these were the lime trees, the lime walk. I specifically wanted my lime trees to have a naivety about them. A lot of pleached limes are pleached really strictly, but I wanted this to feel more like an old bird's nest. So we just wove them in however and wherever, so that it dressed down the smartness. If it would have all been too regular with the pavilions and everything, it could have all looked a little bit pretentious. But by just dressing this down, it enabled everything to have a little bit more of a relaxed feel. Equally with this hedge, you can't really see it here, but this is a tapestry hedge. It's mixed with Buxus Hansworthii and Taxus baccata. So we're mixing the two. Again, just if it was Taxus on its own, it looks more formal. By mixing it, it just looks more country. And again, this pattern making with lawns that the Kipps engravings had, and then the wonderful yew tree at the center. Now, this tree, when we bought the house, was a complete mess. It had elders growing out of it. It was a raggy shape, and it took us 15 years to get it to this pristine shape. But you'll see in a minute, the trunk is amazing. Look at that. And that tree was 600 years old. Always been there, and had always been a topiary tree. And then, you know, my dream always was to have a path lined with lavender. I can't grow it in Wales. Here we had 22 inches of rain. In Wales we have 66 inches of rain. Lavender doesn't do very well. And then this is the view back out. And then I had an area which was my lawn parterre, so a little bit like the photo I showed you at the beginning, but this was just cut out of short grass and long grass. I didn't know what to do between the area which was the vegetable garden here. This used to be a crew yard where they kept cattle, and I converted it to the vegetable garden. And so I wanted some formality, but I wanted it to just be in a very simple way. And there was nothing, you know, for me it worked really well having it just as these two heights of grass cut. And of course, you know, quite a nice transition, this cool, tranquil space to get over to the vegetable garden, which had my greenhouse in it, one that we built, and we made it look like, you know, it's a copy of a Victorian glass house. I had all these lovely old Victorian cloches. But we were able, in this garden, to be totally self-sufficient in all our vegetables. And for me, this is my favorite part of the garden. I'd spend every day. If I could only have one part of the garden, it would be my vegetable garden. And of course, using the walls to produce fruit, the pears, artichokes, mixing the artichokes in with cranberry cordifolia. I love the combination of the two. And peonies for cutting for the house. And of course, one really important part, when we bought the house, we had so many old tin sheds full of all farmer detritus. But I wanted to keep it all, so we just stacked it all in the kitchen garden in this one building, just to give it that feeling of, you know, part of its history. And then that leads you out through, again, on axes back to the physic garden. And then the slip garden on the outside. So these are the rhubarb plants, one of which I took with me. And we're coming to the end of Ganic House Garden, but I just wanted to show you that, you know, when we moved there, first of all, I used to cut the grass, I used to weed kill the grass, and everything was really pristine. 15 years later, by the time we left, I loved all the buttercups in the grass. So I personally was starting to change with how I wanted to garden. And one of the reasons I moved from Ganic House was because I was starting to feel slightly stifled. I'd created a garden, which was lovely. I had all this structure, which I didn't want to change, but it was limiting me with what I personally wanted to move into as gardening. I'm being more slightly gardening for myself in a more relaxed way. So here, the grass parterre that I showed you before, which was all cut, I started to let it grow. And it all was just long grass. And equally, I loved it, but it was a transition period for me, really, leaving things to be longer. And that takes me to where we are now, Allt-y-bela. So you can see completely different landscape. It's in wonderful woodlanded hills with the head of a valley. We don't have any vehicles coming past our house. We're a dead-end lane. And the topography doesn't allow me to have a garden of structure that I had at Ganic House. It's a completely different landscape. I have to say I was really frustrated when we moved because I'd been so used to doing things in parallel lines and straight lines, and I kept looking at this garden thinking, I can't do anything, I can't do it, I'm no good, I can't do it. Anyway, it started by just putting plants in and not drawing everything out, first of all. But I really struggled, and I think, as a designer, I find it very easy to work with clients and say, oh, this is brilliant, we should do this and this and this. With your own garden, the choices, there's so many, it's really difficult because there's so many things you want to do and you can't do them all. You can't grow all the plants you want to grow. But my influences for Allt-y-bela were much earlier. I love Beckley Park, but what I love is just this green baize, this green structure of hedges and topiary. So this very much was in my mind. Here at Brockhampton, the damsons, I love this sort of feeling of fruit, overgrown fruit, and the wildness of that. So my vocabulary and the things I wanted to create for Allt-y-bela were much more relaxed, although there is still pattern making, but the pattern making now is earlier. It's not the Kipps pattern making. This goes back to one of the first gardening books published in England by Leonard Messel, and just shows these very simple patterns. And again, here from Thomas Hill's book, this wonderful vegetable garden, still very organized, maybe a bit more playful with the beds, maybe more like a parterre, and these lovely oak posts that run round that people can lean on. I call them conversation posts. You can lean over and talk to the garden about what he's doing, or perch posts. And this was the first day we moved into our house. It had been repaired by a trust called the Spitalfields Trust. The first thing I brought down from our old house was the tractor with the bucket. Reason, I wanted to get rid of all of the gravel that sat in the front of the house. That was the first job. I just stripped away the gravel and I brought it back to soil. But you can see how, there was absolutely no garden here. This is how it is now. And my structure in the garden here is one that's about the topiary creating the structure. And it's formal, but it's not formal. And it's placed to hold the eye in, but it's very transparent at the same time. So as you walk through the garden, you get views through the topiary into other areas of the garden. It's not a solid hedge. But it adds weight and punctuation to the house. We changed the colour of the house. And we've layered the house up. It's in this very hilly green environment. So, we don't need to enclose the garden like we did at Ganic House. But what I wanted to do here, again, and this is something that followed me through, is this snowdrop thing. So this is where we started planting all of our snowdrops and our bulbs. And what's interesting is that my garden's not very big at all. The actual main part of the garden that's really intensively gardened is tiny. My flower beds are tiny. You're all going to have hysterics when you see the size of my greenhouse. Everything is on a really small, intimate scale. And I like that now. I want to look in and I want to grow really special plants and just my favorite plants and be able to look after them really well in a smaller area. But equally, I want the garden to expand out in the spring with the bulbs. So in the spring, my garden feels enormous because they run right up into the woods, and you can see the bulbs now as far as the eye can see to the brow of the hill, which is lovely. And then in the summer, when the garden's intense and the roses out, it shrinks, and you're in that little bit of garden with the flowers. And of course, my hellebores that I love, and the spring bulbs. I've created a spring meadow at the back of the house. In this meadow, I have lots of iris reticulatas, and I have a variety of different species crocus. The main group is Thomasinianus. But I really love planting up these meadows rather than planting borders with bulbs. Where I'm going to now, it's much more about being in a meadow environment. And when the snowdrops finish, then the narcissi come. And after these are finished, it just goes to a green woodland grass, and I forget about it. I don't do anything. I don't actually garden this, apart from once a year I go through and pull brambles out, and occasionally pull a bit of bracken out, and that's it. But they come down and they're part of the welcome entering the property with the driveway. And this is the one hellebore I bought from Ganic House, which has now got lots of little babies. So we're trialing them to see what colors we get. But this is the approach. So you can see it's a very much more casual arrival to the house. The house is tucked away. It's not a big site. This is the end of our property here, and I'm at the beginning of it. But our landscape is enormous. We've got all the fields, and the fields it's all triple SI, so it's all protected. It's full of orchids, full of amazing flowers. So, that is my garden. I don't need to have a big garden because my backdrop is the garden as well. But on the drive, just having oxlips and having the fritillarias and the primroses, and being much more loose and casual. I don't cut the grass at all here. I just cut it once a year. I leave it to be long. And it's my embroidered Elizabethan flowery mead. And in the grass then, tulip clusiana, which is one of the very first early tulips, historical tulips, and some Valerie finis muscari, and again more fritillarias. And around the house and closer to the house, my topiary are yew, and as I draw out from the house, they become deciduous, so they merge into the landscape. And then as spring really starts, my wisteria starts, instead of having peach tree, I love peach trees, but at Ganic House I had lime trees. Now they're too formal for here, so I've used apple trees instead. This is a variety of crabapple called Everest, and it has lovely russety coloured apples that hang all the way through until about February, and then the birds eat them. And that, in turn, the crab apples enclose a small area that I call the knot garden, and that's my bejeweled garden. That's where my really wonderful historic tulips are, where my rare narcissi are now planted. And this is leading you through into the house. And again here, at Ganic, everything was planted in pairs and symmetrical and had axes. Now going into the door, I just have one tree on one side rather than two. At Ganic, it would have been a pair, and here it's just one. And of course, collecting and having really unusual bulbs. I love this hyacinth called Dark Dimension. It's actually blacker than this in reality. And I've found I'm gardening much more by planting things in pots, my rarities in pots. I'm really excited about doing a whole alpine collection in small alpine pans now, which I would never have thought of doing 10 years ago, but I really want to look at the individual, just have one amazing saxifrage and one amazing something else, or incredible primulas. So I'm sort of wanting to have these collections of plants where they just flower for a period and I can really enjoy just that one thing that's in a pot and it's isolated and it's not necessarily planted in a border. So this is my bejeweled garden and my favorite things in here. I love pulsatillas. I love the whole history of pulsatilla being the pasque flower and the way that warriors used to use the paint from the pulsatilla to paint onto their faces. And Easter eggs were dyed with the dye that came from the root. It creates a green dye, and that's why it's also called a Passover flower, pasque flower. And then in that area, because it's so close to the house, I've got my very special tulips. So these are old Rembrandt and flame tulips, which I then can really look after in this area. And interestingly, this is Clusiana Lady Jane, which is different to the straight Clusiana. Lady Jane, it's really interesting. Her petal, Clusiana in the sun, opens, closes, opens, closes. Lady Jane opens and she stays open, and as she gets older, she becomes like an Elizabethan lady. Her petals curl until they curl right down and they don't have petals anymore. It's amazing. Two tulips, so similar, and they do such still. But that's what I'm really wanting to get into now. I want to observe these things and see how it's... But you can see, look, they're starting to curl. I don't know if I've got a photo of them curling. But I love having these pots of things that I just take in and out of the house. But later in the summer, one of my favorite roses is Cardinal de Richelieu, and I only have this rose in the courtyard garden. I just think it's not a terribly healthy rose, but I don't mind that. The color is so beautiful. And then leading from there up, I have a little quince orchard. Again, quince is one of my favorite trees. I love the blossom of quince in the spring. I love the freshness of the leaves against the grass. But that leads you into what I call the cottage garden. So this is the equivalent to at Ganic House. I had my double herbaceous border, but this is very much more casual. It's not structured. It's one big border that has crisscross paths that run through that you hardly see the paths. You have to literally tiptoe between the plants. And it has my favorite plants in it. It's not a big border, so it only has room for my real favorite things. And this is my favorite peony. And I love the fact that within this border, I've planted wild strawberries, so it feels like a farmhouse garden. The floor is carpeted with strawberries, and my perennials come out through the strawberries. And again, this is a trick that I learned years ago, and it gives this garden a sense of age. It makes it feel like a proper farmhouse garden. I quite often plant rose gardens up and then just have an understory of wild strawberry under the roses. And, passion for starting to collect and curate collections of plants. I've got a big collection of auriculas that I absolutely adore. Whereas I didn't have the time, or I didn't have the focus to do this at Ganic House. And then the cottage garden in the summer comes into the roses mixed in with, this is an amazing Geranium pratense, Phleoplenum summer skies. Normally they only come about that high, but I don't know, mine always end up here. And a new rose that I hadn't really grown before, this is called Sir Paul Smith, but it's a really amazing, big, modern, blousy rose. So I'm starting to get into some modern roses now as well. But you can see how the rose garden here, this garden is actually my rose garden and my herbaceous border that I had before. And this is about the only border I have at the house. And it's twice as big as this stage. So it's not a big area, but it's about the landscape around it. And you can see how, the rose garden at Ganic House had all those hedges and that Baroque pattern. This is our backdrop. We can't have that here. It wouldn't work. And I love the fact that it just goes out, the path stops, there's a little stream, you hop across the stream, and you have to find a little path through the oxeye daisy meadow. There's my greenhouse, it's tiny. It's really hard finding somewhere on site that the greenhouse looks right in, because it's such an old house. As soon as you put a greenhouse, it just jumps out. So for me, my grandfather had a greenhouse made by the same company, the same size, and I've got such lovely memories. So for me, it's really important to have that greenhouse. I will eventually find somewhere to put a bigger one, but I only want to grow tomatoes and chilies at the moment, and it's perfect for that. And then just coming into some of my roses that I have here, this is Sir Paul Smith. You can see the nice thing, she's very heavy, she hangs down, and the flower's enormous. So I train it over a wall, and I pin it over the wall. If you didn't, it turns into a bush 12 foot high. It's very vigorous. You can see the new shoots, look how big, but every autumn we pull those and we peg them to the wall. So it's like a cascade. And the generous gardener, David Austin Rose, that I absolutely love because it repeats. But you can see it's sort of, the rose garden is on the edge of the meadow. And I even have started now planting roses into the meadow. So my rose garden now is expanding into the wild. And that's what I'm getting more excited about than anything in my own garden, is that I'm destructuring the garden the whole time. And most of our plants that we have in our gardens, we've collected them from the wild. We've hybridized them maybe, but, phloxes are meadow plants. I had an amazing holiday in Slovenia and saw fields of Trollius and fields of Solomon seal just growing on a northern hillside in the shade. And it's really lovely to at Allt-y-bela, because I can do that because I've got lots of meadow space. I can expand my garden in a more natural way. And then that leads you into the vegetable garden. And this is based on that Elizabethan pattern that I showed you earlier. It's a very tight, contained vegetable garden. It's plenty enough room for us to grow everything we need to eat. And the fence around it is all hazel that we've gathered in the woods and woven our own fences from. And all the supports are made out of all the offcuts from our coppicing. And the beds are edged in apple, so again, trying to make the vegetable garden as productive as possible. So I've got these step-over apple hedges instead of box around the vegetable gardens, because it feels a little bit more genuine to the Elizabethan, whereas the box feels a little bit more Georgian or Victorian. I just spotted this lovely slug, look at him. But we are organic, so... but again, using the right cloches in this garden because it feels right. And then that takes you from the vegetable garden. You can't see in this photo in the summer, but there's a droveway, a hay track that comes down. And I created this carved droveway in the garden that joins visually to the hay track in the field. And I also wanted this garden to have a little bit of a feel of being a little bit more contemporary. And then in the summer, as the summer goes on, it's full of oxeye daisies. So this is where the clusianas were and all the iris reticulata. So it works quite hard. You know, it's always got something in flower. And then it ends in the summer with the oxeye daisies. I'd quite like to plant asters into here and have an aster meadow for the autumn. So I can really get this long grass to become like a border and then do nothing but species asters in, which I think could be really beautiful. So you can see I'm always trying to think of how to further do things. This has just been cut where the bulbs were, so it's looking a bit yellow. The border at the house at the back, the north border, it's not terribly big. I've just created this pattern of crisscross hedges to enable me to, in here I just have white phlox and I have one rose on the wall, which is called Astra Desmond. So you can see I don't have big border space, but my garden are the meadows and the woods. And then on the other side of the house, the front of the house, I wanted to create a green theatre. We have plays in the summer. It was a very steep bank that kept collapsing into the river, so we set about creating this green theatre, which has actually changed the garden enormously because now the house doesn't sit on the edge of the garden. The house now is within the middle of the garden. And then coming back into the courtyard this summer and just having this sort of more relaxed planting. The oxeye daisies that are in the meadow are in the garden now. I've brought them through to connect it. So hopefully from this, you can see it's a totally different garden to Ganic garden. There's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of the same footprint, but it's a different translation. And the edge of my rose garden, I've got Cecil Brunner, and it's right in the grass. So I don't have a clean cut-off edge. I don't have a hedge dividing the rose garden from the wild, from the pastures. I'm just planting the roses into the long grass that's next to the rose garden. So my rose garden now is expanding into the nature, and I love grasses growing out of grass like this in this relaxed manner. And instead of pergolas and things, I've got so many climbing roses growing into trees in the woods and everywhere. So my rose garden is, it's everywhere, but it's a very romantic and soft way of planting it. And coming back to the theatre, we canalise the stream, and then pulling back from the house. So you can see the garden's very tight. It's just immediately around the house. And this year, this was a garden, this is not my garden, but last year we planted a client's garden with Tulipa sylvestris, which I think is a really beautiful woodland tulip. So this year I've just planted 4,500 of them on my common, and I'm really looking at all about this high, so I'm so excited to see what's going to happen. But this is my meadow that I've been working quite hard on. First thing I've been doing is putting yellow rattle in. This was covered in trees. We cut the trees down. There was no grass, and I just allowed the seed bank in the soil to come back. I didn't put any new grass varieties in. It's all come back from the historic seed. We now have orchids that I didn't plant. The first year we did this, I had one orchid. Last summer I counted 315 or something orchids that were flowering, plus all the baby orchids that are there. So this is just by not using chemicals, by cutting back, mechanically cutting the brambles and the bracken. One thing I did add was yellow rattle, which I don't know if you have in the States. but it's parasitic on grass, and we use it in our meadows. And you sow it early in the autumn, and it reduces the vigor of the grass, which means that your flowers are much better able to cope, your wildflowers. We're very rich, we've got really rich soil, so normally our grass would be so thick it would outcompete everything. But by putting the yellow rattle in, it means that the other wildflowers can start to become the dominant thing. One of our little marsh orchids, another one down here. I've just planted in here last autumn about 300 double buttercups, because the Elizabethans love double flowers. So this is going to be my Elizabethan bejeweled meadow. And I'm adding to it. I've started adding Trollius into it, but I'm doing it slowly. I'm enjoying the process. And I've added this wonderful Trollius it's a chiensis called Golden Queen, with Iris hollandicum. And you can see that, for me now, this is where I am. This is what I'm really enjoying doing. I've got my garden, I've got my small borders that are easy to manage, but I want to expand my garden into nature by using some plants that are cultivated and creating this really bejeweled landscape, which has the Trollius and the irises in. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Arne, so much for taking us through this journey, elegant and relaxed, beautiful gardens, jeweled. We have a time for a few questions from you. Let's see, Lisa's here and Jillian's here with microphones, so if you have a question, just raise your hand.
How long have you been at the
12 years.
I wanted to thank you very much. I'm over here. I just had a quick question in reference to your fruit trees and the fruit that you are organic. And as you were flipping through your slides, I noticed no spots.
No.
Spots on any of or bugs or any
Well,
deterrent with the fruit that we saw.
We're very preventative, so I spend a lot of time collecting up leaves in the autumn and not allowing anything that's virus to fall onto the ground. So it's by keeping it clean is the best way of keeping organic. So, and we do spray, but organically, we spray with peppermint oil, and we do lots of compost tea, which I found works really well.
We have another one over here.
I am so interested in topiary, but I'm just too nervous to start making those cuts. How can one experiment and get a feel for that without shocking my husband and ruining all of these fabulous boxwoods that we have on our property?
I think you just have to start. You just do it. I mean, if you look carefully at mine, some of them are quite wonky, but I quite like it. I quite like the fact, because they look like they've been there for longer if they're not all perfect. And actually, my ones, I don't particularly like them to be perfect. So in the images from far off, they look perfect, but then you start, and what I'm really liking now is that they are actually starting to get a bit more of their own character and movement.
Which of the boxwood was it that you plant with the taxus to create a hedge, a more casual hedge?
That's Buxus Hansworthii.
Thank you.
We have a question over here.
I love the color of your house. Could you talk a little bit about the process of getting the right color?
Well, if you would have seen our house 9 years ago, it looked like a Rubik cube, because every wall was a different color. And it was like that for about a year, because we couldn't decide which color. We had lime washes made with ox blood, and it was too pink, and then we had lime washes made with various mineral stones, and they were almost like copper beech color. And it was a really hard decision. And I kept walking back up into the hills and looking down, because I felt it was really important how the house looks looking down. One thing that was, when it was the creamy white color, it just looked like a wedding cake, and it just jumped out. And didn't fit and sit comfortably in the landscape. And I'm really surprised we went for that ochre color because it was right at the bottom of my list originally. But process of elimination, trying different things, and then painting one whole outbuilding in a particular color and leaving it like that for a while. And just, I think for me, it was about not rushing into it, just trialing different colors. And I was terribly nervous when we painted. It wasn't until we covered up the last square foot that it felt right. The whole process of painting it, which we did ourselves, it was a nightmare. It was so terrifying. As every time I got off the ladder, I thought, oh my God. It just looks like a great big pumpkin. And it was when we got rid of the last tiny bit of cream, all of a sudden it just went, it's right. So, and then, really interestingly, a bit of plaster fell off in the house, and way back in the layers was exactly the same color. And the color is the natural, we chose natural pigments that are in our area and that would have been, so it's the iron ore that's in the rocks under the house. So it would have been that sort of color, so. We use garlic spray on the roses. We use a two combination. We have an emulsion and I don't know the chemistry of it, but I buy it from a company in England, and it's a garlic spray. One is an emulsion and one is a different type of emulsion, and you spray one time with one and one time with the other. But again, with the roses, if we've got black spot, I'll go there and I'll spend a whole day with secateurs cutting the leaves that got black spots on, so I get rid of the fungal attack, and then I burn the leaves, and we just go through that the whole time. The peppermint oil we use more in the winter. We use it as a winter wash, so every couple of weeks it gets rid of overwintering eggs and things. And we use it on our box as well. It's been quite successful with box blight. But it's really good at getting rid of the lichens and all of that, which I love on the trees, but that's where all the eggs get laid. And so, if we can keep everything really... Sorry?
Does it smother the cases, or how do you know how it works?
The peppermint oil? Yeah. Well, it's just you put a very fine spray of it over, and it just, I guess it dissolves the coating of the eggs of the overwintering insects. And it's also really good at getting, on our box plants in the shade, our box leaves are very full of a green, not moss, but a mold, a green mold. Yeah, and it just keeps them clean. It gets rid of all that, which means the plant can be healthier because it can photosynthesize better. And we also use a Savona soap as well as a winter wash.
We have another question over here.
Excuse me, what percentage of peppermint oil?
Yes. I think it's something like 20 mil in a liter, something like that.
Okay, because we now sell a spray here in the United States called Dr. Earth, and it is all herbs, and it does list what the other is also, and we do sell it in a spray, and you can attach it to your hose. Mm-hmm. So I just wondered what percentage, because the oils tend to be...
of what percentage the peppermint oil is in the mix? I don't know that. I don't know.
Is it ever mixed with any other oils, herbs?
I'll look it up when I get back.
When you're creating this meadow, did you sow the seeds directly into the grass, the seeds for the irises and so forth?
The iris is a bulb, so I planted those. So with my meadow, I'm enjoying the process of doing it really slowly. I keep every year adding one or two plants that I want to trial in it and see how they do. And then if they're successful, then I'll go back and I'll plant a volume of them. And then the next year I'll do another plant. So the first year I tried it with the Iris hollandicum, and I planted maybe a dozen bulbs just to see what they would do. And then they worked really well, because I don't want to plant 500 and then I hate the color, and then I can't find them, and every year like they come up and they remind me of my yellow tulips at Ganic House. So I trial it really slowly and carefully, because, you know, for my own garden, that's the joy of it. I want to, you know, I want to plant these things and explore the different possibilities rather than just rush into it and do one thing. I love that process of trialing things. So then I plant more once I know it works.
How much help do you have in the garden, and do you not have deer?
Well, officially, we have one full-time gardener. And we have somebody that comes in and helps and volunteers as well. We don't have deer, no. We have rabbits, but we eat the rabbits. If they eat my bulbs, I eat the rabbits.
Hi, I loved your talk, and it's great to hear you talk about living and growing with a garden. How would you describe your process with your clients, where you're not going to be there for 10 or 20 years? How?
My clients are never that lucky. They don't get rid of me. I'm still there the next year and the next year. So the way my practice works is that I'll design a garden for a client, and we go back for consultancies, and I really love the process of revisiting gardens. So I'm always there, and I'm always there with their gardeners and them, and we're always discussing new things that could be done, or actually that plant needs dividing now, that's got too big, I think we should remove it. So very much that's an individual way that I work. I don't just supply a design and then go. I'm very much involved long term.
Putting reality aside,
Oh,
what
dear.
what in your head would be your fantasy garden right now? You know, just sort of a dream that you might have, that you could do a different one with no worrying about money or time or space.
That's difficult. I get excited by all sorts of things, you know. I really get excited about the challenge of doing gardens where I've never done a garden before. I think I'd love to do a garden in California with the climate there. I love working in Italy on Italian gardens, south of France. I've not done a garden in south of France. So there's certain things on the tick list that I'd like to tick off. But I think, you know, life throws up unexpected opportunities, and I don't have anything in my mind at the moment, but I think, yeah, a nice Californian garden would be nice. Any Californians?
That evolution that you made to that Monmouthshire style, when did that hit you? When did that start?
I don't know, it just sort of, it's only looking back actually, and when I was putting this together, and noticing that, you know, it's a slow process. You don't notice it happening. Well, I haven't noticed it happen. It's sort of like it's always been, it feels like it's always been there, but it hasn't. If I look back at early photos of my own garden and clients' gardens, then I can see that actually I'm changing, I'm evolving. But then I have a client that will say, you know, we don't want all that looseness, and that's fine. I really enjoy creating a garden that's not loose and is different, because the point of a designer is to be able to create gardens that belong to the client. They're not this is my garden, but clients' gardens have to reflect their personality and what they like. So some clients, everything is really neat and really ordered, and, you know, that's fantastic. It's an amazing design opportunity to create something beautiful that fits in with that remit. Okay.
Just quickly, I'm wondering what it is that brought you to Wales into such a completely different kind of landscape. And also, do you garden there as if it's where we live right now, or as if it's your forbidden normal house?
I'm never going to move again. Never. And why did we choose Wales? Well, my partner is a sailor, so boats and gardens don't really go together very well. Seasons are very different, so summer is spent a lot of time sailing, and our boat is kept in the West Country and Cornwall, and Lincolnshire to Cornwall was impossible. And so you couldn't just, if the weather was nice and you had a free weekend, say, let's pop off and take a picnic and go out sailing. So that was the driver, really. And I'm glad we made the change, because also I grew up in Dorset, which is not very far from there. So it's sort of, I think you get to a point where you sort of want to go back to your roots and the environment, and a similar environment to where you grew up, those familiar things. And the Fens was totally unfamiliar. I loved it. It was totally different to anything I'd experienced in this flat landscape. But I think as we got older, I just wanted to sort of be more connected to the things that were in my makeup. Anyway, thank you very much.
Arne will be signing his beautiful book in the Ross Gallery just outside, so if you want another opportunity to chat, he'll be there. I just want to let you all know that the spring-summer catalog is out. If you haven't picked it up or you didn't get it in the mail, you can pick it up on your way out, and we'll see you next month for Edwina von Gall.